And before I introduce the panelists that we have assembled here, we have a great set of panelists who can speak with quite a lot of intimate knowledge about the G20 and gender issues, but I wanted to bring your attention in particular to this publication, which you all received a copy of. The G20 Research Group has been studying with our colleagues in Moscow, as you heard earlier from Elizaveta, the compliance and the number of commitments and tracking how well the G20 does on certain issues. Gender is one of them because although gender reached prominence for the first time at the Brisbane Summit in 2014, it had actually been an issue on the agenda in smaller ways as long ago as 2009. And there's an article in this publication that describes the G20's performance on gender over the last 10 years, written by our colleague Julia Kulik, who has been studying this issue for some time. One of the things that Julia does not say in her article is how well the G20 has performed in the last year on gender, because our compliance report was not completed for the full year when we went to press with this publication. The overall compliance score on the one commitment that we assessed, which had to do with women's access to labor markets, performed quite well. It had an overall compliance score of 85%, and many of the G20 countries scored full compliance, including, perhaps not surprisingly, or perhaps surprisingly, depending on where you sit, Japan. Interestingly, considering that Argentina has quite a strong feminist tradition, it did not score full compliance. It, like a few of the other G20 members, scored a 0, which in our language is a work in progress. So it's not a failure. Anyway, the Hamburg summit was also notable last year because I think the outcome documents from the summit had an overall record high commitments devoted to gender issues. I think there were 46 commitments. So we'll see how, we have not yet done our full assessment of the documents that came out of the Buenos Aires summit, and we will certainly be looking forward to how Japan performs on this issue. Japan has also had a long interest in, as I'm sure most of you are familiar, womenomics, and they have a agenda. And so we now have 3 speakers who are going to speak in various ways about how gender can be integrated into policy, how public diplomacy and gender work together, and then also how the W20 has performed over the last little while. The W20 is a particularly interesting engagement group from the G20. It was started under the leadership of the Turkish presidency in 2015, although I think that its origins came a little earlier behind the scenes. There were a few women Sherpas who were kind of agitating to have some kind of an engagement group. And the outcome was the W20. But the issue of gender had been on the radar screen of the other engagement groups for some time. So this was the kind of culmination of interest and an opportunity for really moving some of the agenda forward. So we will start with Nadia Berger from the Canadian Embassy. Canada has a lot to say about mainstreaming gender in policy and in summitry. So here's the floor. Distinguished guests, chers invités.
it works better when the button on is switched on. So, chers invités, distinguished guests, minasama, konnichiwa. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and I would first like to thank, of course, Osaka University, and of course, the G20 Research Group and other sponsors of this event. It provides us with an opportunity to really exchange and learn and prepare for a better future. So that's really how I see this. And the topic that we're discussing is a very important topic, and I'm very pleased to see there's a lot of men in the audience. Thank you for being here too. So because it's 2015, that was the response given by Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau when he was asked why he appointed 15 women to ministerial positions as part of his 30-member cabinet. And it was at that time the first gender-balanced cabinet in Canada's history. That was 2015. But Canada has come a long way, of course, to achieve and improve our performance in terms of gender equality. But continuous efforts are required. And today in Canada, women represent the majority of university graduates, and they make up almost half of the labor force. A large proportion of these working women, like me and many of my colleagues, including the audience, are mothers of young children. And even in a medical profession, Canada will likely achieve parity in a few years. But that being said, women are and remain underrepresented when we look at performance in leadership positions. They account for just over 20% of our largest corporations' board members and 20% of our elected parliamentarians. So while we're witnessing progress, we need to do better. Women, unfortunately, continue to earn less than men. So that's why we have to do better. It's not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. And the point I want to make today is this, that in Canada, we believe that when everyone has equal access to opportunities on economic, social, political life of the nation, and the issues related to that, this enhances our prosperity. And there's a number of studies that have been done by professional research institutes and companies that confirms that. So this is why gender equality is a priority for the Canadian government. And it's a priority that comes through internationally and domestically in terms of the policies and the positions that we take. In fact, Canada has what is called a feminist foreign policy, which plays, what does that mean? People say, what do you mean by that? The point is that we place priority on addressing the structural impediments and the values and the system we've put in place which may impede gender equality. Our goal is to empower women. So under this umbrella, Canada has spearheaded action in a number of areas, both domestically and internationally. For example, we've adopted a national action plan on women, peace and security. So this document guides our international efforts, and the goal is to, again, take into account the importance of integrating a gender balance approach. The ELSI initiative, you may have heard of this, is also an initiative that is actively promoted by Canada. And through this, we want to increase the meaningful participation of women in UN peace operations. Canada has also adopted a feminist international assistance policy, under which all projects in all sectors now have to integrate gender equality considerations. And if you follow the G7, like some of my colleagues in the audience, at the Charlevoix Summit, Canada made a particular effort to integrate gender equality in all fields of work. You may have seen that Prime Minister Trudeau created a Gender Equality Advisory Council for the G7 Summit in Charlevoix. And that council was co-chaired by our ambassador to France, Isabelle Hudon, and Melinda Gates. And we're very grateful that in that council there were a number of world-recognized female leaders. And for Japan, we were really pleased to see Japanese expert Yoko Hayashi. Hayashi-san is a longtime advocate for human rights, the human rights of women, and she's a former chairperson of the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So what's the meaning of this council? Why was it important? It was a new approach. Through this council, these women leaders met, and they came from all different perspectives, with different backgrounds, and they developed recommendations for leaders. They met with leaders, and they presented those recommendations with the goal of making gender inequality history. And in fact, if you count them, there's more than 100 ways they identify in which G7 countries can demonstrate leadership and make a difference. That's a lot of ways to change and improve the situation. So that's why Canada is very pleased to see that France has committed to continue the work and build on this work during their own G7 presidency next year. So I'd also like to talk about girls, because when we talk about gender equality, people tend to think about women, but it's really about the next generation, and that's really important. So at the G7 summit, the leaders adopted also the Charlevoix Declaration on Quality Educations for Girls, Adolescent Girls, and Women in Developing Countries. And in that context, we, European Union, Japan, Germany, and the UK and the World Bank announced an investment close to 3.8 billion Canadian dollars for the education of women and girls in crisis and conflict situations. That was really a never seen before type of initiative in that range. And from our perspective, it really makes a difference. Once we start to invest in these areas, we can hopefully see over time and over generation a change. And more recently, last September, Montreal in Canada, my hometown, Montreal, was the host of the Women's Foreign Ministers meeting, in which Foreign Minister Kono of Japan participated, and he was the only man there. But his views and his participation was very much appreciated. So in that meeting, all participants underscored the benefit of integrating a gender perspective in efforts to build peace, security, prosperity, and development. That said, we also recognize the importance of hearing and representing the needs of underrepresented groups, and with a view to give them better opportunities. And we do that also through our trade agreements. You can see, for example, you can look at our modernized FTAs, free trade agreements with Israel and Chile, and there are gender chapters in these agreements. You can also look at the new gender provisions in the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. And of course, we're here to talk about the G20. So most recently at the G20 in Argentina, Canada advocated to take action in all sectors to address the systematic barriers, the social norms that prevent women and girls from realizing their full potential. And if you see the communiqué, you'll see that there's a number of items And some of these items, I'll mention them briefly, were actively promoted by Canada as areas for further action. Number one, closing the gender gap in labor force participation. Number two, promoting women's access to leadership position and decision making. Of course, number three, this is a much talked about topic, increasing participation, women's participation in STEM. And also, number four, expanding girls' education. So building on the important contribution the G20 Business Women's Leaders Task Force did, and its work that was delivered this year, Canada looks forward to continue to collaborate with Japan and other G20 countries to follow through on this year's commitment at this summit in Argentina. And our goal is hopefully to find a way to continue and to engage women's entrepreneurs because they are an important voice at the table and on this topic. And obviously overall we're looking forward to working with Japan and other partners to ensure that gender equality remains at the heart of multilateral discussions. This needs to remain a topic that stays on people's agendas. Last year, on International Women's Day, Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau said, "None of us can move forward if half of us are held back." He also reminded us that every single one of us, no matter our gender, no matter what is our gender identity, we all have a role to play in achieving gender equality. And that together, by taking actions together, we can build a better world where women and girls no longer face high walls and glass ceilings. A world in which they are free to realize their full potential, and a world in which we can realize our full economic potential. I hope you agree with these powerful ideas. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion. ありがとうございました。
Thank you, Nadia. That was perfectly on time. Our next speaker is Caitlin Byrne, who we met earlier. So I don't need to introduce her.
No, thank you very much, Madeline. Thanks everyone. What a great delight to be here. I'd like especially to extend my thanks, Jonathan. I can't see you though. There you are. To Jonathan Luckhurst and to Osaka University. It's really fantastic to be here. Beautiful campus and how exciting to be part of this conversation. Also would like to thank Madeline and John and the G20 research team who do fabulous work. And I seem to find myself continually getting drawn into it. Although I'm not an economist, let me put that out front right away. Great. We're amongst, and I don't do ethics. Is that what I should also say, David?
Everyone should do that.
Yeah, well, yes, but you know what I mean. Look, I want to say actually that I'll be talking about the W20. Well, the G20 really as providing a platform for step change for women. I'm taking some of my remarks from an article that I wrote with a colleague who's far more knowledgeable in this space than myself, Associate Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer, who was going to be here but couldn't. And so I did want to extend her apologies as well. But in 2019, when Japan really takes on the G20 agenda, women will have been firmly on the agenda for 5 years. The progress made has been very positive over that time. But I would suggest the time has come to consolidate outcomes. I think there's a lot of talk about the activity of the G20, and that is fantastic, but we need to start moving to outcomes and impact to consolidate those outcomes. And really to call G20 leaders and member nations to account for the progress being made towards gender parity and to promote a far wider narrative about the significance of women in the global economy. These, I think, are the tasks for Japan to take forward in 2019. So I thought I'd talk about three things. Very briefly, just looking at the role of the G20 in putting women's economic participation on the agenda. Secondly, to provide a critique of where we've arrived at. And thirdly, to look at the opportunities ahead. And I think this, for me, is where the public diplomacy part comes in, casting the net wide and really starting a conversation that moves beyond the informed view to the uninformed and sometimes uninvolved many. So looking at how women have really been put on the G20 agenda, and Madeline, thank you for reminding us that actually there have been a number of small steps along the way. But really discussions about the role that women could play in participating and contributing towards economic growth began in earnest at the Brisbane Summit in 2014, my hometown. The Australian presidency at that time made history by including a specific target to reduce the gender participation gap in formal labour markets in G20 economies by 25% by 2025. So 25 by 25. And they also outlined a number of strategies for achieving economic growth. The economic case at that stage was very clear, bringing more than 100 million women into the labour force and providing a massive boost for economic productivity and performance was, to use the colloquial, a no-brainer. As an aside, it was a significant step forward for feminist economic governance, bringing women far closer to full and equal participation. Arguably, this could be seen as one of the first concrete actions to overcome the barriers hindering women's full economic participation, called for by G20 leaders in the Los Cabos Declaration in 2012. The Turkish presidency in 2015 built on Australia's achievements by formally setting up the W20 engagement group as a mechanism that would provide advice to leaders. The W20 then launched in Ankara in September of that year, joined that growing network of engagement groups, the Business 20, B20, C20, Labour 20, the T20 and the Youth 20, as well as the not so formally recognised Girls 20. All of these are important steps in a public diplomacy agenda that Jonathan has spoken about a little earlier. The first W20 communique was influenced by an open poll and delegate submissions and contains a monitoring system for future W20 summits. So overseeing the establishment of this very important engagement group of the W20 during his G20 presidency, some might be surprised to think of President Erdogan of Turkey as the midwife of feminist economic governance in the G20, but there it is. Viewed together, the developments from Brisbane and from Ankara provide an important foundation, a cornerstone really, for the G20 taking forward women's economic governance. It signalled the recognition of women as critical economic actors in governance, not just as unrealised economic assets. And taken at face value, these two initiatives suggest a long-awaited model of agency for women who have been traditionally excluded from economic decision-making and thus reflects an emergence of feminist perspectives within the contemporary structures and processes of global economic governance. China continued Turkey's investment in the W20, having hosted the year before a successful APEC Women in the Economy Forum and discussions between women and green development, as well as women in regional trade. When opening the W20 summit in the somewhat distant city of Xi'an, and distant I mean from the capital, alongside the All China Women's Federation, Vice President at the time used words that showed the legitimacy and urgency of gender and growth being considered within the G20 agenda, and brought the term she power to the fore. W20 delegates at that meeting underlined the importance of seeing demonstrable progress in the G20 employment and labour ministers' meetings and working groups. They urged member states to update and publish their strategies towards their targets and to adopt far more transparent and rigorous monitoring processes, and if necessary, drawing on the technical support of international organisations to make data more comparable and more accessible to the wider public. And can I say, actually, the compliance reporting done around the G20 is a really fabulous step towards that. Of course, there are always other issues in some of these domestic situations, and in China's case, China's own female labour participation rates, though fairly positive, were at issue. The issue of women often being in low-skilled jobs, underpaid, and suffering from many forms of discrimination and stereotyping came to the fore, and that's something that is not unique to China but shared across a number of G20 nations. Other debates revealed a diversity of issues, lifting the one-child policy, accompanying childcare and aged care concerns for women, gendered discrepancies in retirement ages, and the impact of domestic violence, all requiring consideration. The W20 summit in Berlin was the first engagement summit that made global headlines, in part because of the extended participation of Angela Merkel, the then first woman to preside over a G20. The language of the Hamburg communique, the use of women's empowerment, and some might say the avoidance of language, more politically charged language of gender equality, and the focus on entrepreneurship and leadership, some might say was a slight step back. But nonetheless, women's economic empowerment was in fact one of the very few areas where the G20 was able to build some really good common ground. There were other factors at play. The impact of US President Trump in that G20 environment, his preference towards bilateral as opposed to multilateral approaches, had made the search for common ground all that more important. So incredible that it sat around women. Of course, the chemistry or lack thereof between Angela Merkel and Donald Trump created another issue. And in fact, Merkel turned to Ivanka Trump, the self-defined first daughter, and found common ground, both supporters of women's empowerment. On the eve of the W20 summit that last year, Ivanka Trump, together with World Bank President Jim Yong Kim, published an op-ed in the Financial Times to stress the importance of bringing more women into the labour market and encouraging women entrepreneurs. Arguably, Merkel picked gender equality not out of conviction, but purely, potentially, because it looked like one of the few items which was unlikely to be stomped on by the US administration. Whatever the intention, it worked well. In fact, one of the key items to emerge out of that summit really was the Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative, WeFi. It was created in 2017, and it's the first initiative that the G20 have agreed to collectively in terms of tackling gender inequality. Previously, the responsibility to reach commitments like 25 by 25 have really fallen back to states to take on their own. But this fund is a financial intermediary fund managed by the World Bank. It's been created to support women-led SMEs in World Bank client group countries, facilitating their access to capital, providing technical assistance, and investing in other programs and initiatives that will support women. The initial target was a G20 commitment of at least 100 million that would be used then to leverage other funding. The response was far better than expected. And according to the World Bank, more than 340 million has been raised, and a number of G20 members, Australia, Canada, China, Germany, Japan, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, UK and the United States, as well as non-G20 countries, Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, UAE, have all committed to support this initiative. The first call for project proposals was launched in October 2017, with up to $150 million worth of grants made available. I know, I'm really cutting it fine. There's so much to say about women and the G20. A little bit of time. So gender then is a key theme in multilateral economic governance, and inclusivity and fairness are intrinsic to the G20 growth agenda to deliver a strong, sustainable and balanced and inclusive growth across economies. This was exemplified by Argentina's President Macri referring to gender mainstreaming in the G20 agenda this year, so that the three main items under discussion, the future of work, infrastructure for development, and sustainable food future, would all include measures to advance women's empowerment. Gender mainstreaming is an important way for the G20 to take a number of these issues forward. So much progress has been made, enormous goodwill exists, but there is reason for a cautious pause. Change is slow. The status of women across the landscape of economic governance is patchy, and significant gender inequalities persist across G20 member states and non-member states. Well-known feminist scholar Cynthia Enloe prompts us to ask, where are the women? Placing attention on the exclusion and representation of women in various walks of life, to think about how gender is employed in structures, discourse and hierarchy, and in the formulation of rules. It's worth noting that in 2018, only 10% of the heads of state of G member countries are women. The figure for finance ministers sits at 15%. It's a slight increase over the last 5 years. And the official photos taken at each G20 summit remind us of these statistics. And the gender inequalities persist across the countries that make up the G20. Active policies are indeed required to promote gender inclusiveness. But in fact, what we need to do more urgently is craft a narrative about women in the global economy. The W20 is well placed to do this as a primary public diplomacy mechanism, but it can't work alone. And actually, Jonathan, I was really pleased to hear about the work that's being done to integrate some of the strategies of the W20 with the T20. We need to see integration between the W20 and the Girls 20 agenda going forward. G20 leaders need to become more aware of their responsibility to enliven the G20 agenda through their own practices and those that encompass inclusive growth and respect women's economic rights. The G20 summits provide a focal point for actually promoting this narrative. Communiques should be well written and accessible to people outside the G20 process to actually bring some of the issues that we need to know about to the fore. The media, of course, plays an absolutely critical role. W20 summits receive minimal attention. For example, the significant announcement 25 by 25 was largely ignored. It received little media or civil society attention. More recently, the fact that Ivanka Trump sat in the chair allocated to her father, the United States President Donald Trump, at the G20 leaders meeting in Hamburg, the fact that that received more attention than the policy impact she had on women's entrepreneurship was telling. The significant potential of the G20 for advancing economic participation remains entirely underplayed by the media, to the detriment of a wider economic governance agenda. When it comes to women and economic participation, the media are often far more interested in the cut of their jacket, the style of their hair and the shapeliness of their legs, rather than the policy impact they might have for women around the world. As a result, the impact of the W20 remains constrained. And finally, G20 leaders and member states need to be called to account on these issues. There's enormous good work being done by the G20 Research Group, Transparency International, the International Chambers of Commerce, all relating to compliance and accountability. But we're still not seeing enough on the impact or the significance of women's participation and representation in the G20 landscape and in those domestic economies. Casting the net wide to engage beyond the influential few and the involved to the uninvolved and often or ill-informed many is absolutely critical to advancing this process. I know I'm using up all my spare time, but can I just make one last comment that sometimes unconventional sites of diplomacy can have significant impact, and this is where I'm doing my sport diplomacy plug. Japan, of course, will be a leader not just in the G20, but also with the Rugby World Cup next year and the Olympics in 2020. Sport is a fabulous venue for promoting women's empowerment. It's something that's been written into the Australian government's sports diplomacy strategy. A number of other nations are following suit. And that might be somewhere, a space where Japan could actually differentiate itself in this space. So the time for tinkering around the edges is over. It's now time for the G20 to deliver step change for women and their full participation in economic governance. Thank you.
Well, that was a very good introduction to the W20 and the talk that Yuriko Meguro is going to give us. Yuriko is the co-chair of the W20 under Japan's presidency and was the co-chair under Argentina's presidency too, right, for the last year, and has participated in the W20 meetings in Buenos Aires. And I think she's got quite a lot to tell us.
Good afternoon. It's my privilege to take part in this very important panel. I met Jonathan for the first time in July at the Chatham House seminar in London, and he told me about this today's discussions, and he was kindly inviting me to this meeting. This afternoon, this morning, there was a concern about Saudi Arabia, who would be the chair of G20. At the Chatham House meeting, some speakers and commentators mentioned that W20 is concerned about the following chairs of W20, W20, because it's Japan and Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia and Japan were of concern for the activists on W20, and there's no need to mention about the world ranking of Japan in terms of gender equality. So we are not really an advanced country in terms of gender equality. We are developing country. And so I think we are more motivated to prove that women in Japan are very, very, very much committed to show that we are going to take part in the global campaign and even the long-standing battle in order to achieve gender equality. Now, I am supposed to tell you about where we are in Japan in terms of preparation for the communique and the successful goal of getting our communique incorporated into the G20 declaration. Our steering committee was set up only in July. And so the people who became the steering committee were of two kinds, so to speak. One group is consisted of members who are concerned about humanitarian and human rights perspectives as far as gender equality is concerned. Another group was about business because we needed strong members to raise funding. Because we are a civil society team, and our government is behind us to support us in terms of holding the final W20 meeting, which is very costly one, but that is one reason why we are going to have this meeting with WOW, World Women's Assembly, which is hosted by the Prime Minister. So, our overarching theme is toward a new stage of W20, closing the gender gap for new prosperity. Can I hold it? And in terms of the word new prosperity, we meant by redefining prosperity from women's perspective, but more so from a gender perspective. And the goal is work-life balance, or wellness, or happiness, or safety, or dignity, etc., which business people are less concerned about. But this is the issue that we have to really take into account. The solution may be the use of ICT to achieve the goal, or create new markets, or incentivize new investment for new values. And this new values is very much a part of the SDGs concept. Or updating social protection, which is the topic of the coming CSW. Mitigate negative impacts, particularly in reference to digitalization. So the core of our idea is to place gender equality at the heart of the transformation of society toward a new prosperity. Now, W20 has discussed how to increase the participation of women in the labor market, improve women's access to financing, and increase women's involvement in digitalization. While it is still important to pursue these goals, it is not enough to just include women. We need to achieve gender equity in order to achieve a new prosperity. Therefore, W20 Japan proposes the three main topics to be framed as labor equity, financial equity, and digital equity. And these three topics have been the central topics of focus in the past years. And so we decided to upgrade from inclusion to equity. Japan itself is still at the stage of financial and digital inclusion. We are still tackling with this. So it will be a very good push to our governments to think about not inclusion is not enough, but we have to have equity. And these tabulations are taken from OECD. This one shows that Japan, as far as the percentage of 25% by 2025, is already done. It's finished. However, it's only in terms of inclusion. Now, these graphs are also taken from OECD. And so we can see how much gender gap still exists. And this is about the job automation will affect women as much or even more than men. in terms of governance, at the Brisbane, as we have just heard from the previous speaker, the Brisbane goal of reducing the gender gap by 25% to 2025 has been agreed by all the G20 economies. We urge the G20 government to surely meet the goal. However, the overall speed of change is slow, and we need to accelerate change. In order to achieve the Brisbane Agreement, it is effective and crucial to institute a monitoring process so that we can hold G20, this is a misprint, G20 leaders accountable to W20 communiques and action plans. So in so doing, we propose setting up a task force to measure progress on shared key performance indicators. Now, this is the framework of the goals set by W20 for 2019. So we have three topics. We are not going to discuss over and again all these topics. We have done very fine discussions already. Therefore, we are concentrating on the monitoring. And also a new topic which we presented is the governance. This was not one of the major topics before, but all the members of the W20 were very, very happy to have this governance as a topic this year. So, okay. So now the key points of discussion here, and I don't have the time to go over all of them, but for example, the labor equity. Labor covers a wide range of issues in comparison with other financial and digital topics. So you might just go over and look at these. There are key issues we listed, and the solution directions are the kinds of answers in terms of what we can do and what we should do in order to solve the problems which are listed as the key issues. And so, in terms of the governance, key issues to be addressed, for example, underrepresentation of women in STEM, future of work, and these are the major issues that we presented for further discussion. And the solution directions are as listed. So this is the new area in which we have to discuss in the coming dialogues. Underrepresentation, okay. Oh, the task force. As I mentioned, we decided to set up a task forces on W20 monitoring. And we have a great cooperation from international agencies and organizations and expert groups. And therefore, we are not going to try to develop new indicators, but we have a good selections of indicators already established. Therefore, we are going to try to go over them and come up with a list of indicators which are meaningful and more doable among the W20 economies. Now, the proposed timelines. As I said, a committee was established in July, and we have been working like mad without having the experience. The problem with Japan was that in the past 4 years, there were some delegates from each country attending the discussions among the W20 countries. But we had no experience, and we were reading the reports by Germany and Argentina, but they are in different styles, and the activities were different. So, and the most serious problem was that the shortage of time. So within half a year, we had to do everything, at least to come up with the communique to hand in to the G20. So that's one major work. And also we had to do fundraising for activities. So these coinciding and yet not quite speedily in the first place. But after we attended the Argentina summit, W20 summit, we learned many things and we made many contacts. That was a great turning point for us, and so we have been working more effectively nowadays. So what we are going to do is to have international dialogue and then come up with a communique. And after March 23 and 24, which is the date for our big summit, we would still have to go on working for lobbying so that we can get our points clear and be accepted by the G20 summit, the G20 leaders. And we are working to collaborate with other engagement groups. And we have already started this collaboration, and we will be a stronger collaborative group after March. Thank you very much.
Noriko points to one of the challenges with the engagement groups. And I suppose it's a challenge with the G20 generally, because there's no secretariat, there's different kind of continuity that happens from one year to the next. So it's particularly challenging for the engagement groups because each presidency redefines its role. Each engagement group redefines its role under the presidency. And Japan has a real challenge because there's not a lot of time for them to make the kind of progress that needs to happen. So we now have 10 minutes for questions. And I see we already have one, but I hope there are many more, particularly from the back of the room. So David.
Thanks to all three, a very interesting set of presentations. A question for anybody, and then a specific question for Nadia. But the question for anybody is, how many of the G20 countries have taken up GBA+? And the question for Nadia is...
What is GBA+?
Oh, Gender-Based Analysis Plus. So it's quite a detailed checklist of things you should do before you make policy decisions or implementation decisions to ensure that there's no negative impact on various marginalized groups. Gender is one of the key lenses for GBA+. It's supposed to promote equality. The disadvantaged groups. Anyway, so how many countries have embraced that? And for Nadia, what's your sense of the traction in the Canadian government? Are people starting to internalize it? And are people engaging with it more seriously now? I don't really have a sense of that.
Would you like to respond?
the last
Mhm.
yes.
So yes, Canada has been putting this approach in place since we have a feminist foreign policy. And in particular, when we look at our international assistance projects, so anything that relates to project, we're really looking at things through this lens. So we are doing it. If your question is how much people feel convinced about it, I am convinced, but certainly it's a change of procedure and approach. So I would say it will take some time for people to really integrate the approach, but our ministers are very committed to this. That's their whole approach. They want to hear if there's recommendation from public servants to proceed with a project. Well, the question will be, well, if you look at it from that perspective, is it biased? Does it contain unconscious biases? Is it beneficial to all groups? So there's a lot of new thinking that needs to go into that. And sometimes we need those types of new systems implemented to force us to think about that. And from my personal perspective, I think certainly when we look at unconscious bias, we need the help of tools like these. So this is one way. There's probably other tools that my colleagues can speak to, but it's one of the tools in our toolbox.
Rico and Caitlin, have you seen any influence, any pickup on this in some of the other countries in the G20?
I can talk a little bit about some observations on Australia, but I do know we have a representative from the embassy and also Melissa, who is well placed to speak to this as well. But certainly from an Australian perspective, you know, gender has become quite a core value in the foreign policy. The 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper specifically highlights gender as gender equality is one of Australia's values informing foreign policy. We haven't necessarily gone to a GBA plus model, but there is a growing consciousness of how gender sits in policy formulation, particularly in the development space. But I wonder, Basim, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you might like to speak to the Australian perspective more than I may. You're better placed. Sorry.
Well, thank you very much. As you said, the Australian government put out a white paper on foreign policy in which gender was an important part. But just like the Canadian government, we've tried to embed gender into our aid programs. So while we haven't gone quite as far as Canada in terms of every program having to have a gender component or gender analysis underpinning it, but there's an 80% requirement. So some policies get out of jail card, but 80% of our overseas aid policies need to have a gender perspective. In terms of internalizing it, because so much of our aid program does go to the Pacific Island countries, it's become very necessary for us to have gender as part of the design of programs, because we've learned through quite bitter experience that a lot of the social stability depends on the involvement of women. A lot of the breakdown of social order, particularly, for example, in the Solomon Islands, we felt could have been mitigated had women had a much bigger role in society, in the parliaments. And it's not just gender, it's also demographics, where, without meaning to be very dismissive of young men, but where young men have a disproportionate influence in society, we find that there tends to be a greater propensity to violence, a greater propensity to finding solutions outside of a consensus-based way forward. So when there was a breakdown in social order in the Solomon Islands, Australia had to then put together a coalition of countries which went in to re-establish order. And part of that program, which was called Ramsey, included a very big component for bringing in women and community groups like church groups and so on. So, so that applies to social order. But on the health side, all of the health programs need to have a very strong women's component, because when you're looking at very low socioeconomic development, it starts with maternal health, child and maternal health, and that's obviously highly gender specific.
I think
so I'll stop there.
Thank you. And I think Yuriko also has something to say on the issue.
Well, I take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about government policies. In terms of the domestic policies, we had not been very successful in terms of promoting gender equality, although we did have different laws on specific issues. And but from my point of view, it is not in line with the progress made in other countries, and that is the world ranking is very low. One area which is a bit better is in our foreign policy. It's not the overall foreign policy, but in ODA, in terms of the distribution of funding for foreign aid. And it depends on the lobbying by a small group of women, mostly, including myself, to focus more on gender equality and at least targeting on specific women or overall community development and women's roles and so forth. So we are making progress in that area, and particularly on women, peace and security national action plan. It took 15 years for us to have a national action plan since the Social Security passed that. And so it's one area that we have been making progress, but it's not really interconnected, and it's because of a strong social norm that men and women have different roles to begin with, and that is a very, very hard rock that we have to still break through.
Thank you. We just got a little extension, so we have time for another question. Is there, I know there's a question at the front, but I want to know if any of the students have a question first. Yes, one in the back. John. No?
Hello. So I'm Deepthi. I'm a student of International Peace Studies, and sorry for my bad throat.
It's okay, you have a microphone.
So actually, I wanted to understand that, as Mrs. Yuriko said, that it took 15 years to develop that national action plan in Japan. So I wanted to understand from the perspective of developing countries that how that gender can be included in policy making and governance, and like focusing on the developing countries, unlike India. So how it is done, like I just wanted to understand a little bit on that. That is there already existing any such national action plan, or is there is set to be done, or what can be the possibilities if one is set up, then it increases the gender equality in the policy making, or like that. Does it make sense?
The National Action Plan was made it open in 2015, and the document itself was produced with GO-NGO collaboration, and so the process was very, very good. But in terms of the expressions, specific expressions in that first draft, we had gender equality, gender analysis, gender statistics, and those two, the expressions universally accepted, but somehow those terms were changed, and we are facing a review of that action plan now. So NGOs are very keen on watching how it's going to be modified. And the review committee is working on specific aid projects and reviewing how they are planned and what the outcomes were. And we are asking for not only the outcome, but the output, but outcome. And so we are reviewing on the basis of the globally accepted standard.
One more question. We have 3 minutes left. So John, your turn.
Thank you very quickly. Where should the next generation of G20 gender governance go? I have 2 candidates. One, the heart and soul of G20 is fiscal and monetary policy. So that means that we have to move towards strong, sustainable, and gender-balanced growth. I think at home, we know how to do gender-based budgeting, right? Could we just get the rest of the G20 to do it? That's the easy part. The toughest part is the ultimate domain reserve. It's the central bankers. We all know that monetary policy has distributional consequences, including on gender, but we really don't know what they are. The easy thing to do is to have the G20 invite Christine Lagarde to put all her fine University of Chicago PhD economists to work on figuring out what they are, so that when you get into the framework of working group, right, you can align the monetary policy with the fiscal policy to get a big bang. The second one, very quickly, is to focus on the gender SDG and use that as the agenda, which may have greater force as we march towards 2030.
Yes.
Great point, actually, John, and the central banking issue is absolutely critical. Not just focusing that technical expertise that we have already, but then the next challenge will be to distribute that expertise. So, making sure that the central banks of the South Pacific have capacity and the expertise to then draw on that as well, so that you actually spread that out far beyond the G20 nations. I think that's a really critical part. The other on the SDG, I think it would be fabulous to see the work that's being done in the W20 and G20 on women to be mapped against the SDG agenda, and in particular against the SDG on women's equality.
Anything to add?
Just, I would say that in supporting any new type of governance, and even the current governance, I think it's really key to have good data. The data speaks for themselves, and there's a number of studies out there, including McKinsey, that have really powerful number that speaks about the economic benefit and how gender equality brings prosperity. I think that narrative is really important. We need the hard facts to be able to move forward in whatever context of governance we're looking at. And that's why academics are very important.
That's the end of our extension. However, we have another session to get through, and then we have a coffee break. So I think that the next session, which is on climate change and energy, is going to be full of things that are going to make us have lots of questions to talk about over the coffee break. But hang on to your questions from this session for the coffee break too. Thank you.
I know.